Hello, all. Thank you so much for tuning in and welcome to a very special edition of the One Hood Power Hour. As you see, it looks a little bit different, and it's because today we're having a coalition takeover of the One Hood Power Hour. We know in this day and time that policing is not safe for Black and Brown communities. So, what does that leave us with? To answer these questions and more, please welcome the Director of the Alliance for Police Accountability, Brandy Fisher, and the co-founder and director of One Hood Media, Jasiri X. Thank you so much. Y'all take it away.
Thank you, Miracle.
Yeah, thank you, Miracle. Peace and welcome to our first official event as the Coalition to Reimagine Public Safety. This is a conversation that actually began with myself and Brandy last year. Of course, looking at how we approach public safety differently. Miracle said it best. The reality of particularly life in Pittsburgh for Black and Brown folks is it's inherently a place that we're not safe in. When you look at policing, but also when you look at the fact that we live in a city that has one of the highest rates of a white supremacist activity. All this comes to mind when we talk about public safety. And so we came together with the Alliance for Police Accountability because, Brandy and the Alliance for Police Accountability has been in the space around policing, police violence, and have been advocates for our community that have had to deal with police brutality, violence, and harassment for years. And so did you want to talk a little bit about your mission and your work at the Alliance for Police Accountability, Brandy, and then how we get to this point now?
First, I just wanted to say, since Bruce Kelly Jr. was murdered in Wilkinsburg, we've really been heavily thinking about who's responding to these calls. You've seen nationally, we have seen nationally around our country where people with mental health challenges are, being met with force and sometimes death when they're interacting with police. And sometimes the families are even the ones calling the police for help and end up losing their loved ones. And so, we're talking about reimagining public safety. We're looking at what public safety really means to us and what makes people feel safe. And so the Alliance for Police Accountability and One Hood, have been having this conversation for a very long time. And then with the recent killing of George Floyd and the nationwide call to defund the police, we needed to find out what that really meant. It caused so much controversy, so many discussions about it. And the question is, why do people think they will be safer without police? And that's the question we're going to answer tonight.
And to answer that question, we have, several folks. And I think, too, one of the reasons why we felt it was necessary for us to do a community-led process, because I think that's a question that folks are asking. The city did a task force, the county did their own process, but neither of those processes were community-led. It doesn't mean that the folks on those processes weren't qualified, and we're thankful that we have their the information that they put together to inform our process, but it was not a community-led process. And one of the things that was missing from that process was to actually have people on it that have been affected by police violence. And so to have, when we put this a coalition together, we knew we wanted to have folks that were directly impacted by police violence. And so we have Leon Ford Jr. as one of the members of our steering committee. We have Michelle Kenney as another member of our steering committee. And we felt that was important to center those experiences as we move forward around how do we reimagine a public safety that is not that is liberatory, that is not something that is about oppressing us, about forcing us into a carceral system, but one that's about really like rehabilitating folks and really about intervening and improving in people's lives. Did you want to talk a little bit, Brandy, about some of the other steering committee members?
Um, sure. And we definitely, and just sorry, just to echo that, we have been working with, the county, the folks who came together in the county, Aaron Dalton specifically, who we are informing each other's process, and who also agrees that, it is necessary to have things that are community led and community informed. The other folks that we have on the steering committee is Jesse Wozniak, who is a professor at the University of West Virginia. He's a criminologist, has been doing this work for decades. And criminologists have been the experts leading this conversation for a very long time, talking about investing in communities, talking about responding to people who have mental health issues, people living in poverty, right? And so this conversation is things that we see as public health crises, and moving away from mass incarceration when we're looking at public health crises. And so Jesse has been a huge part of this work in helping us transform that conversation. Also, Ashley Comans with the Alliance for Peace Accountability, our programs manager, sits on our steering committee, a force to be reckoned with. We appreciate all of her input. And am I missing one last person?
You are the person who introduced us. Miracle Jones is a part of that too. Shout out to Miracle and thank again the One Hood Power Hour for allowing us to occupy their digital real estate for this coalition meeting. And so, yeah, I mean, it has been a process. We've been meeting every Thursday, and really every other Thursday is a broader coalition. And I'm excited about the conversations that we're having. I'm excited about the direction that we're going. We also want to thank two people that, if it wasn't for their hard work, wouldn't be here. Elise Pinchback Johnson is our project manager and make sure that we're on task and handling the business. And so we definitely wouldn't be able to have gotten here without her hard work and dedication. Yeah, Elise is the truth. And Justin Lang is our facilitator. And, Justin, comes from an art background, but, just somebody that's super conscious, super thoughtful in the approach to the way he does his work. And so we appreciate Justin Lang for being our facilitator in this process as well. Do we want to get into this conversation? Do we want to bring our panel's members? Let's also shout out some of the other coalition members that have been a part of this process. Aaron Arnold of Prevention Point, Pittsburgh. Alice Bell of Prevention Point. Saudia Durant from the Abolitionist Law Dolly from Abolitionist Law Center, Robert Lawrence, who from East End Therapists, William from Abolitionist Law Center, they didn't handle the business. Fawn Walker Montgomery from Take Action Mon Valley has been a part of this. And we have with us tonight, we have the Executive Director of Abolitionist Law Center, who's also been a part of this process, Robert Saleem Holbrook. We also have with us tonight Michelle Kenney of the Antwon Rose II Foundation, and Leon Ford Jr. from Leon Ford Speaks. If we can bring them into this conversation and get this conversation started. If you all have any questions, comments, please put them into the chat. It's great to see so many people joining us tonight for this conversation.
Hey, Miss Michelle. Hi, Leon. Hey, Saleem.
Hey, what's going on?
The experts are in the building.
Absolutely, and thank you all for your time. We know, all three of you all are running around the country, doing tremendous work and powerful work. It was great to see your billboard, Leon. You know what I'm saying, and moving into brand ambassadorship. That was really dope. It was great to see you, Michelle. Taking your mission and your son's name all the way to Tampa, Florida, for the Super Bowl, to continue the work that you've been doing with Rock Nation and the NFL. And Saleem, we know you're wearing about 5 different hats for the work that you're doing in Philadelphia, as well as representing the work of the Abolitionist Law Center here in Pittsburgh. And so I really would like to start with you, Leon, if you don't mind, because I know you're somebody who gets pulled on a lot to do a lot of different things. And you have a conversation with Leon. The brother got 4 or 5 different big things going on, but you actually took your. Could you talk about you took your time to participate in this process, why you thought this coalition to reimagine public safety was important, and why you think your voice is a voice that should be won in this conversation.
Thanks, brother Jasiri. Um, one of the reasons why I decided to get involved when y'all put the call out is really because y'all's been in my corner for years, and as I began to grow and build my own platform locally, nationally, and internationally, I just think it's important to stay connected to community. Um, there's so many different parts of the community that matter, and so like for me personally, I'm talking to politicians a lot. I'm talking to activists. I'm talking to police officers. I'm talking to educators. I'm talking to just folks in community, just to see what their perspective is, and how they would like to see things change. A lot of times, I get invited to panels because people say I'm the expert because I went through this situation and even had 2 trials. Um, however, I know that everybody in community has a different experience and they have a different value to add. And so I'm always interested in learning about the different initiatives that are going on. I'm interested in learning about what people think, should happen in regards to like policy changes, police. And so, I'm just committed to this work, and so I get to learn a lot, but I also get to share my perspective, and I think that is also important.
Definitely. Just to follow up on that, Leon, I wanted to just ask, can you talk a little bit about your work mediating conflict and the need for mental health care in our community?
Yeah, I think that a lot of times, uh, individuals like me, um, there's people in community who found themselves in the middle of conflict, right? And it's just happenstance, especially Pittsburgh. If you're Black in Pittsburgh, like everybody's connected in some way, shape, or form. And so, like for me personally, there's like when there's different shootings that happen, 9 times out of 10, I know the person who got shot, and sometimes I know the shooter, and so this is not anything unique, because it just happens to be that way. But most of the times, people in community, we've been socially conditioned to just stay in our lane, and like if it's not me, then I don't have any, I'm gonna just stay out of that, right? And so, for me being connected to so many different families, I don't know. I just felt like this tug on my integrity as a man, not to like try to turn anybody into the police or anything like that. But if I know this family is hurting because their loved one has been murdered or shot, then I also know this family is hurting because their loved one may be incarcerated, and now these families aren't speaking. How do I leverage my relationships to try to help these families heal? And it's difficult, but there's so much power in truth, and the only way I could be comfortable in my own skin is if I let these families know, like, I love this person and this family over here, but I also love this family, of the shooter, and so I'm just committed to bringing those individuals together. You know what I mean? I also have friends who are beefing, instead of just watching it play out on social media or in the neighborhood. I'm always very intentional about trying to solve whatever conflict is going on between those individuals. Again, it's hard. It takes a lot of trust, but I believe that the trust and the love that I have in the community is one of the reasons why I'm able to solve these beefs and get people to come together. And at the root of it is PTSD. Most people don't necessarily want to hurt somebody, but based off of their lived experience, they may have their older brother, dad, or cousin who was murdered. And so now it's like, yo, if I get in an argument with somebody, or if I get in a fight with somebody, I don't know if this guy is really going to come back and shoot me or not. But now I feel like I have to protect myself. And there's a lot of good people I know that's incarcerated serving life sentences because they felt like they had to protect themselves. And so this is another reason why I'm always talking about mental health, because me going to therapy myself helped me to process emotions and stay balanced, despite if someone's attacking me or offending me. And so if we can make these resources available to more folks in the community, then we could hopefully see a lot less violence.
No, I think that's you make a great point, Leon, and it's one of the things that actually come up in our conversation about reimagining public safety. That is, folks in communities like Leon, is folks, that Fawn had talked about out in the Mon Valley. Is people, when I think about Homewood, I think of folks like Ayo and the work that Amber's doing. Is folks that are in our community talking to people in our community every day, and doing a lot of this mediation work. What would it look like if we supported those folks that were doing that mediation? Because I mean, the reality is, like, we trust you, we love you, we know you have our best interest at heart. And a lot of times when you have somebody in a police uniform that's coming there that we're not familiar with, we don't know, we don't trust that person, we don't know that person, we don't know if that person has our best interest at heart. And so we can support folks that are already committed in the community, that have already shown a track record of doing that work. How could that then look in terms of policing? I did want to come to you, to Miss Michelle, because you have been, not only have you been, prominent in the work around policing and lending your voice to numerous cases besides getting justice for Antwon, but you have also been, in this conversation on a national level. I happen to be with you with the family of both of Gene and other folks. And so can you talk about, what conversations you all are having on a national level around policing and police accountability, and how that could affect some of the work that we're doing here in Pittsburgh?
Well, the first thing I want to say is thank you to everybody who is participating and to everybody on the panel. This is the one time that I do feel like I might be involved in something that we can actually, a change can happen, something can come from it. First, under the UJC, which is the United Justice Coalition for Rock Nation, we definitely support the George Floyd Justice for Policing Act, which is a federal situation. Most states, most cities, we're all experiencing the same situations. They may not exactly be the same, but the killings are the same and most of the outcomes are the same. So everyone wants to figure. It just seems like Pittsburgh, for real. We're really like a groundbreaking city, and most people don't even realize it. People are watching us to see what we're doing here. That state bill that we were pushing, people wanted to know how we even managed to get 5 state reps to even agree to a bill. So I think that whatever we're able to do here will transfer into other states. Most of the mothers that you mentioned that I'm talking to, we have gone from just being a parent who has lost their child to now saying we demand that laws be changed, we're speaking up and we're speaking out. So it amazes me that I watch a lot of moms and we're wondering what's going to happen next. And the next article you read is Tamika Palmer is now deciding to take action against the 6 officers who were involved in, like, we're not giving up. I think that the days of an officer killing a Black person and there being no consequences are over. There may not be court consequences, but as the group, every mom that I talk to, there will be some. And even if those consequences come in changing the way we do policing, changing the way they show up in our community, that's what we're here for.
And Miss Michelle, you have been very supportive and a part of a network of mothers who have lost their children. But you also most recently was involved in your own situation out in North Versailles. Do you mind speaking to that a little bit?
I think that situation in North Versailles, one, let me just say this. I think that situation could have turned out totally different. True. It would have been nice to be live streaming and the video actually show professional showing up, doing a job that they are committed to do. And the outcome would have been a really nice video where you have Antwon Rose's mother, who lost her son to a police officer, walking away from that saying, all cops aren't bad. And even though we're pushing for reform, we know that there are some good ones out there. Unfortunately for me, that didn't happen. And I don't think that people understand that a lot of encounters that we have with cops who shouldn't be on the force are traumatizing. And for some of us, it's reoccurring trauma. That interaction with North Versailles police really did something to my mental state. And I really want people to understand that when we're asking to reform the way we do policing and that there be mental health advisors there. There are times that in my situation, that situation could have been de-escalated in a matter of seconds. But police aren't trained to be mental health officers. And clearly, those particular cops understood that they were being used as a weapon because they said so. And they also understood the impact that they were having on my mental state, knowing that Antwon Rose was my son. I don't know which one of those is worse. To be willing to cause somebody reoccurring trauma, or to know that you're being used as a weapon and still doing it.
And that's exactly, a lot of what we're talking about even tonight is the trauma that our community endures just by interacting with police officers at times. But just the everyday trauma by living in the conditions of poverty, by struggling with mental health and not even knowing what's happening or knowing what's wrong, right? And having to deal with that every day. One thing that you always say is that, the work you do is to prevent our community to continuously endure these type of situations and this type of trauma. Can you speak a little bit about how the Antwon Rose Second Foundation was birthed and what you're doing with that?
Well, the video, we all know how I lost Antwon. And there is a part of me as a mother that will never want to see any mother lose their child in any way, not just at the hands of the police. Like I have a friend who yesterday lost her son. And I said to her, you never want to see this happen to anyone. But when it's somebody that you know, it makes it practically impossible to not reach out because you know what they're going through. And part of my mission with the foundation is to really just give these kids the opportunity to even imagine a way out of their circumstances. Because when I look at Antwon, Antwon had everything that you needed to make it out. He was smart. He was versatile. He was well-traveled. He was well-read. He had the support, and he didn't make it out. So what I want to give these kids the opportunity to not only make it out, but understand that you have to do the work to make it out, because nobody's going to make it easy for you. So right now, Leon's yelling at me to slow down a little bit, but we're looking for a building and just trying to make this happen. You can tell we talk, right?
Leon's always trying to get on all of us about taking care of ourselves.
You have no idea who I am. And his story of showing up is so true, because the night that Antwon was murdered, Leon is my reality check. I was in a daze. And when he showed up, the only thing I could say is, I know this expletive is real. Mm-hmm. And that is why I call him my reality check. Love him to death. But when he showed up, that's when it really hit me that this was happening. So when he says he shows up, he sure does.
Yes, he does. Thank you so much, Ms. Michelle, for sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for Leon. And yeah, I think to me, the more folks that to be on the front lines, speaking about these issues, the better. We look forward to continue to support the great work the Antwon Rose Foundation is doing, the great work Leon is doing. We also want to bring into this conversation our brother Robert Saleem Holbrook from the Abolitionist Law Center, who has also been really committed to a lot of activism in our community around policing. Can you talk a little bit about, Saleem, before you kind of get into the work the Abolitionist Law Center has been doing around policing, just, how the Abolitionist Center came about, like how you got involved in it? Because you were part of it before you even touched the ground, when you were behind bars. Can you talk a little bit about the work and the focus of that work?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, everyone. This has been a very, not just informative panel, but very an emotional panel, because it's dealing with trauma. And when it comes to policing in this country, at the Abolitionist Law Center, we define policing as state violence, because that's what it is. It's violence imposed upon our communities. And it's violence used to treat a community that is traumatized through poverty, traumatized through poor education, traumatized through poor healthcare, traumatized through systematic centuries of oppression and racial discrimination. So that's how we approach policing, not just in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, but in the United States. For the Abolitionist Law Center, how I got involved with the Abolitionist Law Center, I could probably write a whole book about, my journey from the age of 16.
You should write a book, brother. You should write a book, for real.
From, the age of 16 years old, being involved in a tragic homicide in my community, serving 27 years in prison, being sentenced to spend the rest of my life in prison, facing the death sentence at the age of 16. I was fortunate to be released in 2018 after the United States Supreme Court ruled that children could not be sentenced to mandatory life without parole sentences. This judge that sentenced me to life without parole wrote a letter supporting my release, saying that he would have never sentenced me to life without parole, but because it was a mandatory sentence, he had no choice. I'm very fortunate that my sentence was life without parole and not the death sentence, because I sometimes think, what if Pennsylvania was a state like Texas and I would have been sentenced to death and I would have been executed, right? That could have been a possibility. And it actually happened to a 17-year-old in Texas who was sentenced to the death sentence in 1994. He was executed in 2001. And in 2004, the United States Supreme Court said juveniles couldn't be executed. So that could have been very much more my fate, right? So When I was in prison, I met Brett Grody, who was a investigator for the Human Rights Coalition, an advocacy group that myself and other prisoners in Pennsylvania had started in 2001. It was composed of prisoners on the inside and our families who were our advocates. It was inspired by Russell Maroon Schultz, a renowned political prisoner in Pennsylvania who was a founding member of the Philadelphia Black Panther Party, and he was a mentor to myself and hundreds of other prisoners in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, but specifically children who came through the Department of Corrections. Russell Maroon Schultz and other political prisoners made sure that we were not victimized or preyed upon by older prisoners, something that the Department of Correction was not interested in protecting children from coming to a state prison. So I'm forever indebted to Russell Maroon Schultz and many of the political prisoners because they were the mentors. I am who I am today because of them, not because of the Department of Corrections. When I was released in 2018, I joined the Abolitionist Law Center as an organizer, and in 2020, I was named executive director by the Abolitionist Law Center's board of directors. In 2020, at the peak of the national uprisings against the police, we realized that we had to get involved in this fight, right? Because, and not just in Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia as well, because this is not just a Pittsburgh or Philly incident. This is a national problem. A lot of the problems that are going on in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia are going on in Chicago, New York, and Oakland. And that's why this is all tied to the systematic racism, structural oppression in the United States of Black people, brown people, and marginalized communities. And so in 2020, we released a report called Apartheid Policing in Pittsburgh. And a lot of people were upset with that report, particularly the name of it. Some people thought that we should have probably had a more sanitized name, but we didn't want to do that because when we looked at the numbers, we got to remember that apartheid was a system like Jim Crow that was a separate system for Black people, for non-white people. And what we realized in Pittsburgh, as well as in Philadelphia and other cities, is that there is a different system of policing for Black and brown communities. And so here is the picture of policing in Pittsburgh. And these are numbers. This is math. And there's no alternative math. I like to tell people that because people are into alternative facts today, but There's no such thing as alternative math, right? In Pittsburgh, more than 60% of the time police use force, it was against Black people. Black people make up only 23% of Pittsburgh, and yet they are 43% of individuals involved of traffic stops, even though only 61% of Black people in Pittsburgh own a car, as compared to 89% of white people. Black people in Pittsburgh account for 71% of all frisk. Black children account for 83% of all warrantless search and seizures.
Can you repeat that, please? Can you just repeat that fact, please?
Yes, Black children accounted for 83% of all warrantless search and seizures for individuals aged 11 through 18. 69% of all warrantless search and seizures are against Black people, period, regardless of what age they are. 63% of all arrests conducted by the Pittsburgh Police Department are Black people. 57% of the use of force incidents from 2010 to 2015 in Pittsburgh were against Black people, despite this demographic accounting for roughly a quarter of the city's population. When it comes to incarceration, Black people make up only 13% of Allegheny County, but 68% of the jail's population. During the time Bill Peduto has been in office, the Pittsburgh police budget increased for $40 million, an increase of 60%, and that he's increased the number of police officers 13% in 6 years, from 857 officers to 985 officers. Something else, too, is that violent crime in Pittsburgh is only 6% of all crime, and that Allegheny County has 109 police departments, the most in any state. And since 2015, and this is a very troubling number, county police from these departments have killed at least 11 people, all of whom are Black. So that's a picture of policing and incarceration in Allegheny County. And that is why we say it's an apartheid policing, because it disproportionately impacts the Black community in Allegheny County. And when you look at these statistics, there's no getting around these statistics. These statistics also compare to national standards, because what we find in Philadelphia and other systems is in cities is that the communities that are over policed and the communities that are most impacted by mass incarceration are often and are always the least safe communities, right? So you would think that these communities would be safe because they have more police in them and more people are being locked up. But it's the opposite effect, because these communities are traumatized communities. And when you deal with trauma, with violence, you only perpetuate that violence. And that's what's happening in our communities. And that's why this Reimagining Police Public Safety in Allegheny County is part of a national conversation about how do we reimagine, how do we shift the power so that our communities are not subjected to state violence, which policing and prisons are, but are subjected rather to the type of services that they need to deal with this trauma that is in our communities. And those services are extensive, because it's not just education, it's childcare, it's better health care, it's better housing, it's better jobs. And because all of these are institutionalized in terms of when I say about institutionalized, because this oppression is institutionalized and is structured oppression, it's going to take a while for us to dig out of this hole, but we're not going to be able to dig out of it by relying on police, more prisons, and the very system that has dug us in this hole to get us out of it. So that is why conversations like these, figuring out alternative ways to deal with harm in our community, are very important. And I just want to close with just this thought. I don't like to use myself as an example, but I feel like I have to. Leon touched on this earlier too. There's no wall in our community between victims and offenders, right? This harm, this trauma that's going through our community cuts through every household. It cuts through all our families. So as I mentioned earlier, that at the age of 16, I was involved in a homicide and served 27 years in prison for it. My family, I lost 2 cousins within 1 year to gun violence in Philadelphia, right? So my family, like many families in Black and brown communities, are on both sides of this issue, right? We're not victims over here, offenders over here. And that is the message that we have to relay to the state, to the police, and to politicians who want to continue us down this path of putting us against each other when it comes to addressing trauma in our communities. Because as long as we allow that division, that wall to be between our communities, we're going to continue perpetuating this harm and trauma in our communities.
No, I agree. I did want to pull up. Thank you for that. I did want to put up, and this is from Dustin Gibson. It's just a comment from Dustin Gibson where he actually said, under Mayor Peduto, the police budget has increased almost 50%. The overall budget only grew 5% over the same period. So just to kind of put that in perspective, and I really want to come to you, Brandy. I know we're both moderating, but I kind of want to ask you this question because you are, and then also, just speaking of apartheid, somebody actually posted, Jerry Dickerson just did a op-ed in the Public Source about Pittsburgh being an apartheid city that if you have not read, it's in the comments. I would encourage you to read it. Very powerful op-ed that included a lot of stats. But I said that to say, because Brandy, you have been one of the people that have been best able to me to describe the conversation around defunding the police. And Brother Saleem touched on it in terms of all of this money going to policing. Particularly in our community, not seeing it. And I know that, very shortly, we're going to go into a national conversation of folks that have used police alternatives to great success in the different cities that they're from. But can you just talk about, like, when we say defunding the police and people get scared and nervous, what we really mean when we say that conversation, and why we really believe that these are resources that our community desperately needs for its own safety?
Just serious putting me to work, y'all. I did want to, I'm definitely going to answer that question. I want to first expound a little bit off of what Saleem stated. And I think what is very important is narrative, right? A huge part of the reason why we wanted to do a community-led effort is because we need to tell our story, right? And yet data says a lot. But when data is informed by lived experience, then you get truth, right? And you don't just get a perspective. You get the fact of what is actually going on. And that's what we have here. And when we talk about narrative, we need to talk about definitions. And when we had these discussions, we were talking about, how do you define violence, right? How do you define violence? What is violence to you? And we beg to differ that, poverty is violent, right? Poverty is violent, and that is violence. And that is why we look at violence as a public health crisis. And so when we're talking about these things, it's putting these things into a proper perspective for people's everyday lives. And so if I'm living in poverty, they were just trying to close 6 schools, right, in Pittsburgh public schools. And even when they're open, the education is not the greatest. And so if I'm living in poverty, I have a lack of education. I'm not being poured into. I'm not being educated. I'm not given the tools for my ability to thrive. Right. I'm in survival mode every day. I have trauma. We want to say that certain communities have the highest crime, or the highest violent crime, but in turn we don't want to serve those communities about the effects of that trauma or that crime that they are experiencing, because we paint the picture that the whole community is causing the crime, the entire community is causing the crime, and so we leave a community abandoned, and by design. It's not by accident, because it's not happening in certain communities in our neighborhood. So if you beg to differ and say, well, how could this be by design? That seems like a conspiracy. We have very intelligent people running our communities and running our country and running our cities, very intelligent individuals. We sat at tables with them. They're able to know what Squirrel Hill needs to thrive, right? They're able to see very clearly the type of development, the type of education that needs to happen in affluent communities in our area. But for some reason, when we get to predominantly Black areas or areas with people of color, we all of a sudden do not know what to do. We all of a sudden have no idea what development is needed, what type of education is needed, what opportunities are needed, what type of jobs and infrastructure and training. We somehow just forget everything. And we know that's not practical. And so it has to be by design. And if we are not investing in our communities, I don't care who you are, if you're purple when you're blue, when you're born, if you are raised in these conditions, you're going to get a certain result. And so 1 + 1 = 2. If you have poverty, a lack of education, and a lack of development and investment in the community, you're going to see crime, because people are going to behave in a way, and what you see is behavior to survive, right? Even the Bible says, do not despise a man because he steals because he's hungry. Even the Bible says that, right? Because you are going to survive. Nobody is going to sit and not eat and let themselves die. And so we put people in these conditions, and then we criminalize the behavior that we know is going to come. And so that's why what we are saying is we need to invest in these communities, invest in education, and invest in healthcare, get people out of survival mode, give us a living wage, and so we're able to thrive. And in the meantime, while we are healing our communities, that we need to be met with care. We don't need to be met with violence. We don't need to be met with policing. We don't need to be met with the use of force. We don't need to be met with over incarceration, and especially about our youth. I mean, this attack is really on our young people today. If we look at these numbers, 63% between the age of 11 and 18, that is ridiculous, of just being patted down and searched. That is violent. That is traumatic. Just imagine you're 11-year-old just being stopped and frisked just because of what they look like. And so this is what our communities are dealing with. And nobody wants their children going through this. Nobody wants to live this way, and nobody should. And so what we're dealing with is a human rights crisis. We're dealing with a public health crisis when it comes to the Black community, the things that we need to survive and thrive in this world. And so, the data shows it. People's lived experience is showing it. And the only thing that's missing is the will to do it. And so now, that's why we have to come together with people who share our values to make sure we get the outcomes that we deserve.
Sorry, my mic was muted. You had 61%, it was 83%.
83, I'm sorry, I said 63, yeah.
3% about that war. And you had talked about, you saw this, Miss Michelle, that you actually saw this occur directly, and this attitude directly impact the community where you used to live in Hawkins Village. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
It is, as I was listening to Brandy, when you hear things, you automatically go to relate to something in your own situation. And after Antwon died, I began demanding that lawmakers get involved in what it was happening in that small community. As we all know, Rankin is a small town. You could fix it by snapping a finger. So the irony is that literally the public stepped up. We had Feed the Hood out there. We done had One Hood. We done had community bashes. The public literally began to invest in the community. We had people bringing food, bikes, toys, anything that was necessary, offering to help with tutoring. Like, it wasn't just that people were willing to give. People were willing to lend a hand to help these kids and help the residents at least do a turnaround. We had administrators offering to help educate these kids. And instead, we have 30 lawmakers show up, tour the community, see all the problems in it, and their response was to tear it down. So now you have a whole Black and brown community that is being forced to relocate and picks up a whole nother set of problems.
Right.
Rather than just addressing the issues at hand and doing the work that they get paid to do.
And Jazari, can I touch on that real quickly? Because
Absolutely.
That issue of gentrification, right? Whether the manner that Ms. Michelle just explained, or what's going on in Philadelphia and other countries across the country, other cities across the country, is another form of Black displacement, right? And in Philadelphia, gentrification is contributing to Philadelphia having the highest homicide rate right now in the nation, because what it is doing in the Glaze Ferry section of Philadelphia, developers have pretty much just brought that whole section out, which is in South Philly. And now you are having a lot of families being dispersed across the city. And when you bring in a lot of people who are trapped in poverty into another neighborhood that is trapped in poverty, what you have is a lot of younger men who now are vying for resources in the community, right?
Right.
And we know what resources are to poor communities, to poor youth.
Right.
It's drugs. And it's contributing to a lot, the uptick in violence in Philadelphia is these displaced families, these displaced neighborhoods being dropped in other displaced neighborhoods that are already trapped in poverty. And now it's increasing the violence in some of these communities. This just isn't in Philadelphia. It happened in Chicago in the early 2000s, yep. Right? It happened in Absolutely. LA. This is a national problem. And it's part of the reason why we have to make sure that we address gentrification with the same sense of urgency And even if that whatever shape that gentrification plays out at, right?
Right.
As a public safety measure, right? What Miss Michelle was talking about, which they did to my community in North Philadelphia back in the 90s, or if it's developers who are coming in and doing it, we have to address it with the same sense of urgency as we address mass incarceration and policing in this country. And it's an area that is often overlooked, and we should really
True.
focus a lot of attention on it, because what it's going to do is just going to move poor people from one area, drop them into another area with poor people,
Right.
and it's going to have them fighting for those meager resources in that other area.
Well, I
No,
just I want to expound on that just a little bit, very briefly. And that's because, I mean, it all works together, right? If you ignore a community,
yeah,
allow the violence to uptick, then you can say it's so violent, people don't want to live there, people move out, then you gentrify the neighborhood, right? This is the
absolutely.
design that we're talking about that happens. But one thing I do want to highlight is before we move into our second panel, is this drug use thing leading into the violence. And it is a huge problem in our neighborhoods as well. You know, whether you're talking about K2 and the effects of it, and how it's impacting people's brains and how it's causing young people to react violently. You know, we don't talk about that in our neighborhoods, but it is pervasive. Or whether you're mixing that with Xanax, you know, and ecstasy. So when you have all this drug use and abuse,
Right.
trying to, you know, cope with the trauma, and this uptick of violence, you know, this is the reason why we're saying you don't answer that with incarceration. You answer
No.
that with healthcare. You answer that with assistance and the help that people need, you know, for those drug use problems, for those mental health issues.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because that has been part of our conversations. Issues around drug use and policing, issues around homelessness and policing, and issues around mental health that, you know, Leon, you've been one of the leading voices on. And I did, when we talk about gentrification, also wanted to acknowledge the work of Stop the Station. I live in East Liberty. As somebody that lives in East Liberty, I don't want a new police station in East Liberty. Where it's more than enough police in East Liberty. Go to Bakery Square, go to Giant Eagle, police is there. Like that, we don't need a police station. So I did want to acknowledge that work. You know, Leon, you talked about, because just like you're saying, all of this is, you know, really oftentimes we self-medicate because we don't have access to mental health or folks, you know, that we can work with. You had an innovative idea of really even having mental health community centers in our community. Can you talk about just what, like, your journey for healing has done for you, and why it's important for really to begin to, you know, promote mental health in response to the trauma that our community deals with every day?
Absolutely. Thanks, Brother Jasari. Before I answer the question, I just want to, bring up this lecture from a professor at the University of Illinois Chicago named David Stovall. He actually has a lecture called Engineered Conflict about school closings, public housing, and law enforcement.
Wow.
I mean, this, everything y'all said, he goes in so deep in detail. And so, like, for the listeners out there, you could just could just YouTube Engineered Conflict, and his lecture will come right up. For me, I didn't realize how triggered I was after being shot. When I was 19, and really, my response was based off of what I seen from the civil rights movement, but everything I did was pretty much trial and error, right? Like, I didn't know what I was doing. Nobody had a toolkit to say this is what you do after you get shot by a police officer, and so I just had to learn, and it's interesting because there's so many people who would reach out to me as though I was an expert, right? I'm like, I'm not a mental health therapist, nor am I a attorney, right? Like, so you don't need me to help you with your case. You need to talk to an attorney, right? And I will also say, like, everybody's relationship with their attorney is different. So if I introduce you to somebody, you have to build your own relationship, and so, like, going through this whole journey of learning and trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do? Like, what is justice? How do I receive justice? The best thing I decided to do was not run for city council, but drop out of the race for city council, right? And focus on my mental health. And so, like, around the time I was running for city council, I would, cuss out Bill Peduto on Twitter. I would cuss out, Chief Schubert on Twitter. I mean, anybody who was, wasn't doing what I thought they should be doing, they was just they was feeling that heat. And so when I left America, I went to Europe, and then, I was still, see my therapist. I came back and I was able to be really objective in my leadership. And so what I now, from my perspective, there's a lot of people that don't understand power, right? And so, I feel like when I, finally learned to understand the power dynamic with dominant society, because I understand power in the neighborhood. You know what I'm saying? It was really power in the neighborhood is what kind of helped me galvanize the community, right? But now I'm dealing with, all these different aspects of power, from dealing with the mayor's office, or dealing with, state politicians, or the DA's office, or the police department, or the Fraternal Order of Police, or foundations, and all these different people. And so healing allowed me to go into these spaces as a leader, where I would be objective, and I'm not really focused on feelings, right? As an entrepreneur, somebody could write a fire business plan. It could be so, touching to the heart, and I will skim through the story, but I really want to know how I'm gonna make some money. Like, that's the bottom line, right? And so, as an activist per se, I get that there's a lot of feelings that we have, but how do we get results, right? And so this is how I'm able to, talk to different leaders who may not believe in the same thing as that I do, right? And I'm able to listen to them. I'm able to learn from them. And I'm also able to find innovative ways to get things that I think will benefit community, right? And so therapy is what helped me out, because I'll go in these spaces, and if this was 2 years ago, some of the things that I hear, I would say, all right, like, I'm not working with y'all. I'll probably cuss them out, or go on Twitter or Facebook, and it'll be a whole thing. I'll try to get a whole bunch of media attention. But now I'm able to listen and understand what they really mean from a psychological standpoint, and help them become better leaders for the community, right? Because at the end of the day, if they're in these positions of power, you can't just dismiss them and say, all right, I ain't rocking with you. Like, no, because these people will continue to make decisions, right? That are going to have a positive or negative impact on community. And so my thing is, for people who care, like, really get involved, and try your best to understand power dynamics. You know what I mean? Try your best to position yourself to buy your self interest. I always hear, now leave with this. I always hear activists talking about how we live in a capitalistic society and all this stuff, right? Well, we live in a capitalistic society. What is the incentive for these white folks that you're always talking about to just all of a sudden do the right thing because it's right? That's
Mm-mm.
not how it works at all. Nobody's going to do the right thing just because it's right. And not in this world. There may be some people, right? But that takes a lot of communication and relationship building to get to that point, right? And so if you want to be super radical, people like, if somebody say, yo, Leon, like, if they insult me and they want something from me, I'm not gonna give it to you, right? But if you build real relationships, and kind of understand where people come from and say, all right, my lived experience was different. I don't judge you, but we still need this basketball court. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know what I mean? I understand that you may think that it was justified that I was shot. Some officers believe that. Cool. That don't bother me. You know what I'm saying? How do I make sure I'm getting some like people that I know jobs? How am I making sure there's money going into workforce development, right? So I just challenge, leaders. Like, you're not always going to hear what you want to hear. If I can sit across a police officer and say, hey, man, maybe you shouldn't have pulled off. And I can say, hey, maybe I shouldn't have. That's fine. But, yo, we need X, Y, and Z. Like, yo, I'm able to put my emotions to the side, my feelings to the side to get what I want, right? For the community. That's how, from my perspective. That's how you get. That's how you make things happen. And the more people we have in these spaces, building relationships with the community at large. I mean, you could say police officers ain't part of the community; they don't live there. However, they work here every day, right? So there should not be a police officer that's patrolling in Homewood or in Garfield or East Liberty that we don't know on the first name basis. You know what I'm saying? And so let's just, be objective and, figure out how to work with people, how to educate people, and to ensure that, we are negotiating for our self-interest.
No, absolutely. Thank you. That reminds me of one thing, Brandy always says is the difference between mobilizing and organizing. It's two different things, you know what I'm saying? And so you're talking about some real organizing for real change. And that does take, dedication. That does take, sitting across from people that you may not share the same end goal, but it's like, okay, if we can agree to do this right now, and if you can do it, as Leon Ford, and I know Miss Michelle, you've done it as well, then what issue should I have to go ahead and do it? So we want to thank you all, one, for being super involved in the process locally to help us steer things, to help us focus this conversation, and just for sharing your time with us today. Miss Michelle, Brother Leon, Brother Saleem, appreciate your wisdom, your words, and for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much. So
Thank
Thank
we
you.
know
you.
it's not easy.
Peace.
No doubt.
Take it easy.
Absolutely. So we're going to move into our second portion of our panel, and in this portion of our panel, we have some national partners that we have brought in part of this conversation. We wanted to talk to people that where they have had success in terms of whether it's reimagining policing or organize the community to put more resources into our community, those that need to fight against that poverty, that's violence that Brandy so eloquently talked about. And so we have Tim Black from Cahoots, who I know you at Alliance for Police Accountability have been working with for many years. We have Shaun and Nikkita from Decriminalize Seattle that's with us today. We have Dominique Johnson from the Center of Policing Equity, and we have Vinne Cervantes from the Denver Alliance for Street Health Response. And so, man, we got. I feel like we got like the Justice League coming together. The Justice League for reimagining our policing in our community. And so, I'll start. I want to start with you, Tim, just because you've been working with Alliance for Police Accountability, so you have some insight into the great work that they've been doing for many years at the forefront of this issue of policing, but also in kind of what's been happening in Pittsburgh around this conversation. Can you start with what was your insight into thinking about policing in a different way in terms of mental health folks being involved, the success that you have, and how, or do you believe that we can kind of implement this blueprint in different cities?
Yeah, I mean, I got into this work, with Cahoots here in Oregon after spending years doing street outreach and just watching these outcomes unfold in the community in front of me, watching situation after situation that was resolved in a lot different way because Cahoots was there. Because it wasn't just officers that were responding to these situations, that there was this compassionate and informed response that was going on. And I was just really inspired, honestly, by seeing that kind of approach to this kind of concept of public safety. With the privilege of being able to talk to communities across North America, the biggest thing that really stands out for me is that while leadership tends to say that there's got to be some sort of evidence-based one-size-fits-all approach that we can handle, the mark is being completely missed. We need to be having a lot more conversations like this, where we're actually listening to the folks that are being impacted, by policing in a community. The people that might be accessing, a different kind of resource, right? And those providers who are trying desperately to have a seat at the table so that they can really advocate for, the reforms that we've been talking about today.
Absolutely.
And just to be clear, Jasiri, Tim did a conversation with us for defunding the police and what that means. That was the first time we actually worked with Tim.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, it was a while ago though, right?
Yeah, just what last? Yeah, well, the pandemic.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been a year. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that conversation and how it went?
Yeah, I mean, really, what I saw when Brandy and I first, had that interaction last year was that there's tremendous potential, that there are so many voices out there that are being ignored, and what's happening in Pittsburgh, what's happening in Pennsylvania, really needs to be listened to, and hearing Leon's experience about what it was like to run for city council, really resonated with me, because it's just, evidence of the fact that, we're just up against such massive systems here. I remember walking away feeling some optimism though, from that conversation with Brandy, because I have this opportunity to really just engage with the folks that are really directly connected to this work. And, if we can't get the electeds to listen, then maybe we need to become the electeds.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you said that, because I happened to be on Twitter and I saw I think a commercial from Nikkita about to be an elected. We have Nikkita and Shaun from Decriminalize Seattle. Seattle was one of these places in 2020 that saw a lot of activity around the protests. We saw folks in Seattle actually take over a police building, and we also unfortunately saw a young protester lose her life on the highway. Can you talk about how the movement in 2020 with losing Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd began, how you all began to mobilize and organize in the wake of that, that actually led to the defunding of Seattle's police? I know that's probably a long story, but can you just talk about that work? How you all came together and what was the process and you all actually leading up to this point? And Nikkita, if you want to talk about what even made you say, hey, I want to take another step of actually going into office and being one of those folks that are representing our community on that level.
Yeah, I'll jump in first. Seattle actually has a really long history of pushing forward an abolitionist agenda. Even prior to the date that I'm about to give, I would say probably for 20, 30 years, working with folks that are on the inside with groups like the Black Prisoners Caucus to try to figure out how we make legislative shifts that change the material conditions that people are living in so that abolition can become a reality. We can render policing and prisons as we know them obsolete. And so in 2010, a native wood carver, John T. Williams, was murdered by Seattle Police Department, and the Native community really organized a very significant grassroots movement that brought a Department of Justice investigation. And that particular investigation rendered results finding that SPD was using excessive use of force, and it was likely racially disproportionate. At that time, they were not tracking the racial data to be able to fully say that it was racialized, but there was enough there to at least say that Seattle Police Department needed to quote unquote be reformed. So Seattle then moved into a space for 5 years with a consent decree where the goal was to put in place a multifaceted accountability system. Fast forward, and what we already know is true is when we continue to grow policing accountability systems, investing more and more money in systems where police investigate themselves, where we expect that a racist, anti-Black system is reformable, we're going to continue to get the same results, which is that Black and brown people continue to be murdered and assaulted by the Seattle Police Department. And ultimately, we don't achieve our goal, which is public health and public safety for everyone. So, fast forward to the summer of 2020, and we're having 4 crises: a climate catastrophe, an economic recession, a racial justice uprising, and we're in the midst of a global pandemic that is exasperating already gross injustice, racial injustice, economic injustice that existed. And as a result, a lot of people took to the streets in Seattle. And after 10 days at a barricade of being literally brutalized by gas, mace, all kinds of pellets, quote unquote, less than lethal force, Seattle Police Department just suddenly vacated the East Precinct. And what emerged out of that is what I think the media hyperbolized, the Chop Chad zone, which was really a lot of folks practicing mutual aid, community collaborations. And what would it look like if police were not present? Now, that being said, there were incidents of violence that happened in that area, but those incidences were not any different than what was happening across the rest of the city, which showed us that even right next to the police department, a year before that, a woman had been murdered. Police don't keep us safe. They respond after crises and harm has already happened. And just recently this year, we've seen 2 people murdered by SPD in the midst of mental health crises. And so we know that the system of public safety that we've chosen to invest in as a society is one that is continuously failing us. I ran for mayor in 2017 as a part of the Seattle People's Party campaign, really on an abolitionist platform with the intent of being a disruptor of these anti-Black policies that we continue to allow to be put in place and challenge our city to push towards a more humanizing view, but really understanding that we need to invest in affordable housing. We need to invest in healthcare, mental health care, healthy food, clean water, all the things that we know meet people's basic needs and make us less likely to have encounters with the criminal punishment system. So really, running for office for me is not so much about the seat as much as electoral politics is a huge platform for cultural shifts. And if we win that seat, it can obviously be a huge platform for changing policies. But it is grassroots movements that make it even possible for an unapologetically abolitionist candidate to run for office.
I just want to put an asterisk beside that, because after Leon spoke, I didn't want to speak again because we had to shift panels. But Leon said something about, which is true, when someone's in office, if you have to deal with them and they're in power, you want to think of the best way to help your community. But you don't have to deal with them, right? Because you definitely can replace them. And so, shout out to you, Nikkita, and everyone else out there who decides to take power when power is trying to take us. So I just wanted to ask Shaun if you wanted to just talk about, the work that you all are doing now and how you are, implementing alternatives or, changing the police budget in Seattle.
Sure, I can start and then pass it back. So hi, y'all, I'm Shaun Glaze. I use they, them pronouns, and I am one of the research co-leads for the Black Brilliance Research Project, which is not, I'm not with Decrim, I'm with Black Brilliance Research. We do partner a lot with Decrim. What is Black Brilliance Research Project? It is over 100 community members with that lived experience coming together and really determining what really creates true community safety, health, and thriving. Being paid living wage jobs to do that and really direct our city's divest, reinvest strategy. How are we doing that? well. Like I said, we have hired community members themselves because we also believe that that lived experience and data turns into like a really compelling, irresistible truth, and that those closest to the issues are closest to the solutions. And so we went out, we did arts-based research approaches. We also did surveys, we did focus groups, we did music, we did a lot of different ways to talk and engage with our community, not just to find the answers to what creates true community safety, true community health and thriving, but to use that data to literally write the roadmap for where investments need to go in this year's budget cycle. So that means here in Seattle, not only did we divest from police like 20% this year, but we were able to really leverage that on the ground organizing that made this work possible to really push and drive a policy agenda that is also democratic. Like, we designed it so that Black and brown people, but especially Black people, set the terms of what those investments look like, that we have the authority to really own the process, and that we create a process where we, the people, get to decide where $30+ million will get invested in our city this year alone, as well as how it'll be invested in future years. So it's pretty exciting. Again, like Nikkita said, it only happens when like community decides to really invest in that, boots on ground every day, marching up in people's faces. Like, it really takes a huge push, because our city council alone, our mayor alone would never, could never, do anything like that. It takes community really making it happen.
Oh no, that's you're 100% right. Was that, and I want to come to you, Vinny. Was that the process? Was it similar in Denver when it came to the work that you all began to do in 2018 around alternative responses to police? Was it similar to kind of get this program off the ground in Denver that is a Reimagine Police? Was it a full community effort? Can you give us a little bit about how that came about?
Yeah, so I'll say, a lot of the ways that we started to organize was based off of trauma that was experienced in the community. Think about Michael Marshall, a Black man who was unhoused, who experienced mental health crises, who lost his Bible and experienced a mental health crisis, and was arrested for trespassing and brought to the jail, where he was later killed. We think about Marvin Booker, who happened, similar, very similar instance. Jesse Hernandez, Paul Castaway, and so many names in Denver, and that gave us inspiration to try to think about what could be different in our city. We thought about the fact that our city has $588 million as a public safety budget, which is about 1/3 of our overall budget. Most of that goes towards policing and jail, compared to about a less than 1% budget for our affordable housing. Given that so much of our policing is directed towards our unhoused community, that was another inspiration for why we wanted to do this and start to re-envision how we approach crisis and conflict in our communities. Yesterday in Denver, it snowed about 20 inches plus, and we have a policy in Denver where unhoused folks, they cannot use anything other than their clothing for shelter from the elements, or else they get ticketed, arrested, jailed, or harassed, displaced. And so these are all reasons why we knew that we needed something different. And I had been personally involved in reform efforts around use of force policy, independent oversight, accountability with the DA's office, but none of that was truly transformative in its approach. It was really conceding some of our demands to city council, to district attorneys, to elected leaders, without actually putting forward what we really envisioned as a transformed approach to public safety. And so in 2017, I learned about the Cahoots program, which really, was an inspiration of what could be possible in our city. So we started to build a coalition around that of a lot of different organizations, impacted people who drove this idea. And then we visited Eugene in 2019. And when we came back, there was a work group that was coalesced around this idea. And that the result of that work group was the launch of the STAR program, Support Team Assisted Response, last year on June 1st. And, we launched this program in the middle of this national uprising around policing, but it was not intended that way. But I think it was the right work for the right movement. And, so the program has been on the ground for a little over 7 months now, I believe. In that time, we released a 6-month report that noted that the STAR program answered over 700 calls, not one of those calls resulted in calling police for backup. In fact, the opposite dynamic was true, where police instead called the STAR program to replace them for incidences that especially involved mental health crisis, substance use issues, and homelessness in Colorado. The single biggest issue that they responded to was trespassing as related to homelessness, which again is proof of concept. As I mentioned earlier, Michael Marshall was arrested for trespassing and jailed. And so that was the first 6 months. It's still in its pilot phase, and it started with a $200,000 grant from the Caring for Denver Foundation, but has since been expanded at the city level to about $1.5 million. And they're hoping for a matching grant from Caring for Denver to make a $3 million program in 2021. But we're in a process where we're shifting the program from living under the Department of Safety to living under the Denver Department of Health and Environment. So a public health focused program that lives separately from police is kind of what it's shifting to right now. And I will be the first to say that the program is a significant degree towards what we want, but it's not fully what we want and what we wanted to envision in terms of responding to safety and responding to crisis. Right now, like I said, it's expanding, but we've also worked on similar programs, and we've worked on expanding other ideas about what public safety can look like. We helped to launch a program called Restorative Denver in 2019, which uses community-based restorative justice as an alternative to prosecution and discipline in the criminal justice system. So far, that program has answered about 90 different cases and processed them through community restorative justice, and they are now expanding to felonies, as I understand. We've also, we believe in upstream as well. If we're to think about our communities as a river, and we think about upstream as housing, employment, education, as those issues impact downstream violence, addiction, crime, we want to address those issues as well. So we're working on a statewide truth and reconciliation process to tie hunger with issues like racism and poverty, and really understand the connection between public safety through a statewide story collection process of impacted voices. We're also working, we use our street medics to respond to immediate situations in our communities with regards to hunger, with first aid issues. We were responding to the protests last year, where we created a medic network that really was able to protect people, or at least heal them in the midst of state violence. And we also are working on a universal basic income program for unhoused folks. And we do other things in terms of education and employment as upstream ways to really redefine public safety. But I also wanted to kind of speak to the point that was named at the very beginning of this panel, where you all mentioned that there were task force that were created, to kind of talk about these issues that were without community voice, without impacted voices. And, that's something that we're really recognizing, is that, while there was a national movement that was reinvigorated around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, who rightfully deserve justice for their murders, some of us knew these issues to exist in our backyards long before that. And it's frustrating to us that we have elected officials, whether at a city level, at a state level, at a federal level, who are recognizing these issues after last year's protests, but are implementing demands that we've been asking for years and decades. And so, it's a shame that somebody in Minneapolis or Minnesota was killed that invoked change in Colorado. And I think that's a shame that we weren't listened to, that we weren't acknowledged to begin with, to implement some of these changes. And as we see some of these things pop up, we also had a task force that was largely absent of some of the community voices who had been working towards these issues. We also had legislation that was without our voices. So we see the language, we see, right, the demands, the values, the ideas that we've been putting forward for years in some of these legislation and some of these task forces that have been created. We see our language, but we don't see our voice. And that needs to be really important moving forward as we continue to work towards change. And I'll also just end with the sense that we need a national reckoning around mental health and around medical services, because as we understand police violence as transcending any department, any one municipality, any one state, and being a system of policing that is rooted in violence and oppression, we also understand the medical systems to be similar and the mental health systems to be similar. And as we are asking for more social workers, for more mental health workers, we have to acknowledge the ways that they are extensions of the systems of violence and oppression that policing represents. After all, in Denver, it was not just police who killed Elijah McClain in Aurora, it was also a paramedic that killed Elijah McClain. True. And so, we're acknowledging that as well, that we need a reckoning around how we, as we demand these services to be implemented as alternatives, how they are also representative of expansions of the current system.
Man,
we
that's
see
so
our
powerful.
language. but we don't hear our voice. Oh my goodness. That was like resounding, echoing. I mean, we see our language, but we don't see our voice. That is the epitome, I think, that goes across as a result of so much work that Black and brown people do on the ground every day. And when it's now, time to reckon with change, they've been listening all along. And that's why we always say it comes down to will, right? We have these discussions for the sake of education, for the sake of people who are, coming up and learning these things. But those folks in power get it, and they know very well what needs to be done. It's just about, like Nikkita said, those boots on the ground,
Right.
and making that happen.
And I would say too, kind of like one of the points that Leon mentioned is if you're talking about capitalism, I mean, 1.5 million is a lot less than 500 million. You know what I'm saying? When you talk about a program that, answered, 700 calls and didn't need the police. So like these solutions are also, more cost effective for us as a community. And what type of society are we looking at when 1/3 of every dollar has to go towards policing? Just like you said, that's one in definite need of like a mental health intervention. So, I want to come to you, Dominique, because you are looking at this from a national lens, from the Center of Policing. Kind of how are you all, kind of looking at, and thank you also, Vinny, for acknowledging, in Minneapolis right now, George Floyd is not on trial. Derek Chauvin is on trial. Although when we talk about the narratives, what I'm saying, George Floyd can't be on trial, unfortunately, because he's no longer here. But we're watching the Derek Chauvin trial where we're hoping for some form of justice. We know that, whatever money that his family got, is not justice for them. They didn't go out seeking that money. They would trade that money for the life of their family member and loved one. Can you talk about, how the Center of Policing is looking at, all of these changes and coalitions and reimaginings that's happening on a national level, and, how you all are, looking at data and are you engaging, are the police departments or people coming to you from the police that are seeking a change? What's happening?
So I first want to unmute myself, actually. Thank you all. And it's a pleasure to be in your company. What I can say is my name's Dominique, and I'm the Senior Director of Community Engagement at the Center for Policing Equity. And we work with law enforcement and communities to help make policing less racist and less deadly. And we do that by working with the data that departments are already collecting or identifying data that they should collect, and then analyzing that. Because you can't change what you don't have a really good understanding of. And we have a lot of communities that come to us and they're looking to talk about the national conversation because that's what's bringing them to the work, but they also don't intrinsically understand that police departments are nuanced and they're based upon localities and locations. And so we are effectively helping to bring that data and that information to the communities who are asking about it. So we have been working with many different cities, and I can talk a little bit about what's been happening in Ithaca specifically, but at a whole level, we've had about 25 scientific products that have been delivered to different cities across the country. And what we've seen is that there has been a 26% drop in use of force incidences, 13% decrease in injuries to police officers, and 25% fewer arrests. But the crime is not surging, which is what people always assume. Like if you're making things smaller, then somehow crime is going to surge. And that's just really not true. And then seeing these results, we can think about how that leads to fewer civilian injuries, fewer lawsuits for departments, fewer officer injuries, and just dramatic improvements in Black and brown communities because they're not facing burdensome policing. I think that there has always just been this notion that we have to fix what's happening with law enforcement and not this broader project of democracy and public safety and race, and thinking about how we lift communities and leverage their voices, especially in this unfortunate moment that people are now saying, listen to us, we hear what you have to say, and communities are finally leading that work. CPE has worked with the data analytics and the scientists and the law enforcement agencies and communities. But this is the first time that we're having communities come to us and say, what are we going to do? Here's what we want to know. How can you give us this information? And who do we need to bring to the table? Help us bring them to the table. And for the first time, law enforcement agencies are saying, okay, we actually do want to sit at the table too, because a lot of times it's just folks are caring about the same issues deeply. But when you are articulating those issues, it's easy to find a little bit more alignment. And so that's what we've been finding as well, which I think it's really helpful. I just think that we as a society haven't even given people the space to imagine what it could look like when you're not enforced, especially by police. It's not that investment in Black and Brown communities. It's not really the reckoning of thinking about taking a clean break from policing that was built on the impetus of enslavement of Black bodies, you know? So when you really think about that longer term ideal or narrative that we need to really focus on, I think you are encouraged to think about what's beyond policing and moving into public safety as a whole. And so that's what our organization is hoping to do, is to produce the analysis to identify and reduce those causes of racial disparities, not only in policing, but then lifting up what does that mean when it comes to public safety overall, and how do we leverage the relationships that we have with the current public safety ecosystem of police departments and policymakers and communities to do that work together.
I'm hoping people hear this message being echoed throughout the night, is that policing it does not equate to public safety, right? It's that policing and public safety are not one and the same. If you don't take anything away from this, I'm hoping you take that.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about Ithaca? I think I saw we saw something. Was it GQ magazine?
Oh my goodness, everybody's talking about this. So first of all, I just want to lift up the Ithaca community. I always don't like to speak for folks who are doing this work, right? I've been invited here, but I always lead with the work that folks are doing this on the ground. And I'm not a native Ithacan. I'm not from Tompkins County. I am someone who was asked as a part of CPE to be a thought partner to this process. And so I always encourage you to think about those folks in that community working group. I can list them names, but I'll wait. I'll give them their space, but happy to give those names where due if folks want to look more into the folks on the ground doing that. So we as CPE acted as a thought partner. It was for free with Ithaca and Tompkins County, and all decisions, of course, were made by Ithaca and Tompkins County, that team. We guided the process and we helped elevate with our subject matter expertise in law enforcement, in data, and some of that community engagement work. But the researchers in Ithaca pulled together the feedback and the experiences and set the cadence for the focus groups and how that went. And what I will say is they came to us, I think September 2020, Mayor Myrick and Chief Nair came to us and they said, you know, here's our town, here's what we're facing. We also are in the middle of this New York Governor Cuomo Executive 203 order, which was the New York State Police Reform and Reinvention Collaborative. And so what we did was help, like I said, as facilitators, as consultants, to lift up the folks in the community in those different working groups. So you had a law enforcement and public safety working group, you had a community working group, you had researchers coming together, and then everybody met in these internal resource meetings to sort of lift up, like, how are we going to do this? Who are we getting feedback from? What is missing? What do we need to know? How do we do this? And it was very rigorous. And then on like February 22nd, I think that's the date, the Reimagining Public Safety Collaborative of the City of Ithaca and Tompkins County put together this draft report of these recommendations, which you're finding in GQ, because Mayor Myrick has sort of went on a traveling show to sort of talk about this work and talk about what the community has been able to pull together. What I can say, is that we're in the phase now where we have these recommendations. They're not final. They go to the Ithaca Common Council and the Tompkins County Legislature on April 1st, which is the date for that Executive Order 203. But real talk, I think it's always a process with getting communities input in, right? So I know that what you'll hear a lot of in the community spaces is, it's not enough, it's not this, it's not that. I help facilitate when asked, if community asks me, can you host that town hall because you hold these city and county officials to the fire? You ask the questions that we want to know, and they trust you, and we trust that you can help bring those conversations out. And so what we found is that, one, people feel, of course, you're not hitting enough, you're not doing enough. It's the bare minimum. But it's been really refreshing to see some of those folks who are researchers, who are part of those community groups, being able to talk with different community stakeholders to say, okay, it might be the bare minimum, but what else are you proposing? What do you want to think about? Here's your chance to give that feedback. What could we do? What's missing? How do we move forward? And I think having the different layers to those different working groups has allow for a comprehensive look at the public safety landscape within Ithaca. And so I think, everyone involved is really proud of what's out here now, but it doesn't mean that this is the end, and it doesn't mean that this is enough. And so that's what I want to really just emphasize. It's like, this is here, but it's always a process, and community always has a stake in it. And I think this is the first time that people are really in the community, saying, Mayor Myrick, we need more, we need this. And he's always available to sort of have those tough conversations.
I just had a quick question, and just very, I don't know if we have questions from the audience or not yet, but I wanted to know, and anyone can jump in here, what did you find to be the biggest obstacle in the process of doing this work? And then on the other side, what did you find to be the greatest help?
I think the community keeping it real, in particular in Ithaca, helped, because you're not going to give people a plan that they're not feeling. And so you're going to have to rework what you're trying to sell and what people's value adds are. And you're going to have to make a concerted effort to make sure that you're not missing members of the community. I think that helped a lot. I think what hurt is time. People are always at a mandate time. Would this have come about if it wasn't a mandate in place? Would this have come about if folks didn't feel that this was right after sort of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor? Like, this stuff has been happening. And I think a lot of that narrative, the national conversation that we find at CPE, always triggers the local communities to come to us. But what they are often struggling with is the fact that your local landscape should be determined, your public safety landscape should be determined by the folks that live in that local landscape. And that includes everyone. And it's not going to be one size fits all. What could work for your locality does not necessarily work for other people. And sometimes folks come and they're like, give me that special. What they're doing over there, I want to do that. We get a lot of Cahoots. A lot of people ask about Cahoots. Can I hear more and more? And it's like, how do you know if that's actually going to work where you are? And so what we do is we bring them materials, or we try to, here's what we know about Cahoots as much as we know. Why don't we put you in touch with someone to learn more? I think people just have to be able to have a better understanding of things, because you cannot change what you don't have a good understanding of currently. Doesn't mean that it has to exist in totality or forever, but you do have to understand what you're working with so that you can provide better solutions and outcomes and thoughts and recommendations.
Thank you. Nikkita, did you have feedback on that?
Yeah, if I were to speak on some of the greatest obstacles here in Seattle, and I think we take a very drastically different position on this in the Center for Policing Equity, is that continuing to invest in systems that already exist and have actually proven to be more harmful is very harmful. I think communities have been very clear about what we want and what we need. And I think we talk a lot about data, but it's often not data that we collected or we get to use the way that we want to, which is what I find to be very significant about the Black Brilliance Research Project being done, instituted, led by Black people in a way that addresses the needs that Black people have, rather than continuing to expand policing infrastructure for reforms and accountability that even some of the folks that were on Obama's 21st century policing task force said won't work, because at its roots, policing is problematic. And so I think one of my hopes as an abolitionist and also as an on-the-ground grassroots organizer is that we get to a place where, for community members who are fighting these things, that the knowledge, the lived experience we have right now is taken more seriously, rather than our cities bringing in consultants and paying these consultants to do work that I think we're already doing. And take very seriously things like, if we had more affordable housing, we would have less issues. If we had mental health counselors that did not act as soft cops, we'd have less people in the criminal punishment system. If we had good food, clean water, community schools, we could make things like policing and prisons obsolete. In Seattle, King County, where I live, there are currently about 20 young people in a juvenile detention center that was built last February for $233 million that could keep 110 young people in cages. Why we spent $233 million on something that currently has 19 young people in it, I can't tell you, but I do know that $233 million could have gone a lot farther in providing things that meet people's basic needs. I think similarly, Seattle Police Department has one of the largest budgets in the entire nation. $410 million is just their base budget. And they spent the majority of the summer throwing blast balls and gas at people even after they were told not to. So I think very significantly, I hope that after this last uprising and probably the uprisings to come, that we'll actually get to a place where we really hear the voices of community members and take seriously investing in the things that meet the basic needs of people, rather than expanding failed accountability systems.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I do want to come to you with Vinne, and then I want to come to Tim. But one of the, I guess, fun facts that I learned was that Seattle police had the most police that participated in the January 6th uprising at the Capitol, which I thought was wild. Like, they travel far. they travel far to run up in the thing in DC. That's wild. But I do want you to answer that question as well, Vinne, because you spoke very directly about the fact that you got something. Like, it wasn't everything that you wanted, but it was better than what. Can you just talk about that process? Because I think, like, because sometimes, I Nikkita, I feel that spirit of, like, we really, and one of the things that the Ithaca article that struck me, because it said replacing the police. I'm like, okay, wait, now you got my attention. You know what I'm saying? So, like, we're really, because in many cases we feel like if left to our own devices, we can do this ourselves. Like, we've proven it time and time again that as a community, we could do this ourselves. So can you talk about, Vinne, that process of, coming with, you got everything you wanted, but you didn't get everything you wanted, and how that looked and how you were able to, collectively reconcile that with the organizing that you did?
Well, I'll say, we're still navigating that. We're still trying to make it a program that we really believe in. And that's, the opportunity we have now, where we were able to help move it from the police department to the public health department, where we're, working to make sure that these are community organizations, not necessarily $100 million mental health institutions that are running these programs that are also working with the police. So there's a lot of work that we're currently doing to just ensure our own values are continuing to drive this program. We have the city touting the STAR program as something that is a community collaboration that is, not business as usual, but we continually find community being diminished in our spaces there. We at Dasher is the community facilitator of the STAR program, and we are still left out of a lot of decision making, a lot of awareness about the program. So we just insist on the program and the things that we need as a community. And that was part of the process of Dasher being created as a way to really insist on what we need, not what we think that we can win. But, we do have needs in our community right now. We have the pandemic, which is, we know that's going to increase mental health crises, substance use issues, and homelessness. At the same time, we have this national movement around policing that recognizes that our system of policing is the catch-all response to those issues, and it shouldn't be. And so we have urgency in our community where we have community members who are dying. We have people that are suffering, that we know that we need some kind of response right now that shifts away from policing being that main tool that we use in crisis, but that it's still not everything that we want. And I'll also just add that, we are, we're working with other cities in Colorado as well, 10 different cities, and we were able to approve a program in Aurora. So that program will look a lot different than Denver's program, which will look different than the other programs that we're working on with community members in those respective cities in Colorado. And one thing about the rioting or the policing during the protests, there's an incredible image in our state recently, last year, where we had folks that wanted to organize because we had some, militaristic white supremacists who were organizing in Denver who wanted to do their own rally. We had other folks that showed up that showed up in opposition to them to collect food to distribute to unhoused folks. Denver brought an entire police department with riot gear and also brought police from other cities to aim their weapons at people that were gathering and distributing food to unhoused folks. Meanwhile, the militaristic white supremacists that they weren't looking at, they weren't paying attention to, one of them ended up getting killed in an incident, in a shooting incident. So the police who showed up there in huge numbers with riot gear didn't stop the one instance of violence that actually happened because they were too busy looking at people that were gathering food and distributing it for unhoused folks. And I think that's a really incredible image that resonates across this country with regards to policing.
No, absolutely. And I think like that, when you look at what happened at the Capitol, I mean, that's what we all saw. It was like, oh, wow, like police can actually show restraint, and oh, wow, there's not enough time or to prosecute everybody. Oh, the court can talk about like some abolitionist principles around not prosecuting folks. Oh, these things can actually happen. Well, we want them to happen with us too. I do want to come to you, Tim, because there's a Jay-Z lyric that I'm reminded of where he says, you made it a hot line, made it a hot song, and it's like right now, kind of like what Dominique talked about. It was a lot. So much attention kind of came on Cahoots, post all of the uprising in 2020. Where it was like Cahoots, and I see you have pilot programs launching in different cities. Can you talk about, like, I guess one, like how you manage that attention, and then how then do you go about like expanding this model to different cities, understanding kind of like what Vinne said, like it probably is going to look different in these cities. Every city has their own problem. So how are you kind of handling that attention, and how are you managing taking this model to different places?
Yeah, so I'll let you know when we figure out how to handle the attention. Every day is surreal for us. But as we engage with all these other communities, something that Brandy said earlier really resonated to me, and that was that we see our language, but we don't hear our voices, right? And one of the reoccurring themes is that there is this assumption that if city leadership goes through the motions of engaging with Whitebird Clinic to learn more about the Cahoots program, if they do a splashy public forum so that we're seeing paneling alongside some local experts, that'll buy them some time and they can slow things down. We can enter into a perpetual cycle of feasibility studies and, kind of at best, we get regurgitated catchphrases that folks may have heard from many of the, examples of communities across the U.S. exercising First Amendment rights. But there's no meat behind it, right? They're just regurgitating something because they know it's going to get them reelected, right? It's going to take some pressure off of that other unethical thing that they're trying to avoid any recognition of. And so there is just this profound lack of the voices of those who are being impacted by policing in America right now in these conversations. There's this comfortability, that we experience with those folks in power, making sure that these are closed door meetings, because then there's not going to be that tension. There's not going to be that conflict, when they bring up something that their constituents are saying is, needs to change. And there's also this perception that if you just change your mobile crisis, you bring in a Cahoot style program, that's going to fix everything. That's going to solve all of your issues in public safety, right? You're not going to have racist cops anymore. You're going to have paramedics that, can engage in compassionate work. And that we don't need to invest in any of the other services, without really even asking why it is that we have such a serious issue going on, why crisis has become so prevalent in every, community in North America. And when we start to shift the focus to look at more of the fact that these crises are emerging because needs are going unmet, whether that need is food, shelter, community, representation, that there are needs that aren't being addressed. And if we can start to really look at some of those underlying issues, if we can create low barrier shelter, right? If we can stand up at our harm reduction services, support mutual aid and violence interruption, community mediation, then we can start to really work as a community to support ourselves and bring the responsibility for maintaining safety back into the public, rather than, rely on some other group who are empowered, who are given a uniform and weapons to create that sense of safety for us.
Definitely. I wanted to, and I'm sorry, that wasn't me that said that. That was Vinne. I was just echoing Vinny's words. I don't want to take credit. I wanted to just highlight on something that Nikkita brought up about data. It's something that, is very important when it comes to this work, is our narrative. And I consistently talk about it, and I will consistently speak about it. It's our narrative and our story, and the way data tells that, and sometimes the way data doesn't, right? And so, and I use this as an example. So we heard Saleem earlier state some statistics, right? And I think that he said 67% of people incarcerated in Allegheny County jail were Black. And someone could take that statistic and say, see, it's all the Black people committing the crimes, right? They could take that data and come up with their own interpretation and say that that's what it's informing. And so I was wondering, Shaun, if you could speak to the importance of not just having data, but having a proper interpretation, and how, having, Black people doing that informs the correct narrative.
Right. Yeah. I'm thinking a lot about this. I'm thinking a lot about how in our work, what we did is it's not just Black people. We worked really hard to make sure that it was not a monolithic experience of Blackness. So at least a quarter of our researchers were directly impacted, formerly incarcerated, for example. We had people who were trans, we had people who were sex workers, we had people who were just all the different people with disabilities, we had immigrants, we had refugees, we had elders, we had youth. We really focused on making sure we had a really broad variety of experiences coming in, because we do believe that the lived experiences are the most important and will help you with the framing when you get it right. A lot of times what we see is people will bring in, to Nikkita's point, outside consultants to do some kind of work like this with a goal for having something that is palatable. Because most of what community is going to tell you is what community's been telling you for decades. It's we need housing, we need mental health, we need youth supports, we need economic development, we need a better crisis and wellness system. Those were our 5 main investment areas that we found in 2020. But if you look through the archival, what people have been demanding for decades, that hasn't changed. Why would we waste time and energy finding, people who could tell us something that is different? Well, when we don't want there to be much different from the status quo, when we want to spend 3 to 5 years doing research on questions we already kind of know the answer to, is because we want to find, or at least people in power want to find, something that feels a lot less scary, a lot more palatable than doing what needs to be done. And so I think that when you really focus on making sure your research has that lens of people who are directly impacted, who know firsthand, because they've seen it, they've tasted it, they've touched it, they have felt it with their bodies, they have lost it through their connections and relationships, you are going to have the framework you need to be able to collect the data you need, but also to push for the change that needs to happen. The last thing you will see coming out of a project like this, where you actually have people who are close to the issues, directly involved, is anything that is watered down. If you really have people leading this and who have that lived experience, they're going to tell you how it is. They're going to tell you what needs to be done. And it's not going to be making little minor shifts here and there. It's not going to be about let's just, send, people to babysit the, state sanctioned violence that's going to happen. No, they're going to be that's a bad idea. Let's do this other thing instead. And I also think the research, what's really great about doing research like this with people who are directly impacted, is they'll tell you some uncomfortable truths, which is that right now here in Seattle, one of the things that we heard over and over again was such excitement from our city council members for something like Cahoots. We're hey, we're sibling cities. Y'all mostly white, we mostly white. This could work, right? And it's yes. How do we think about racial equity in a system that is targeting against systemic violence and racism? Well, when we focus the conversation that way, we ask different questions. We think about creating a different network that isn't just copy paste this over here, but that is God, what does it feel like to really care for each other with each other? Well, actually, what we learned is a lot of people are already doing that. They're just under-resourced, which is why here in Seattle, one of the biggest wins we had from our movement was this grant program that's at least $10 million and scaling up local responses to create safety and health, so that we don't just copy paste over Cahoots, but we have 40 or maybe even 100 different programs that sprout up from this that get supported. So I think the answer is, when you put the right people in charge of making sure that you're collecting, analyzing, and reporting on that data, you have something that's a little bit, can make people uncomfortable. But if you do it right, it makes abolition irresistible, because it's real and it's people's lives and their experiences, and the data speaks for itself.
Thank you so much for that response. So on point. And Tim often says, and I think he said it tonight. Yeah, everybody loves Cahoots. Everybody's calling us, but we're telling you that we might not work where you are. And so it works here. We can give you a template. We can tell you our process, but it doesn't mean everything that we did that is going to work for you to do, which is why these processes are necessary. And people might ask those questions. And then Jasiri and I had those questions, like Jasiri started off the conversation with, is, if the city is already doing this, if the county is already doing this, then why do we need, why do you need this process? And why should we invest in this process? And I think your response gave more than I was even imagining, but it was right on point.
Yeah, no, and I think that, I mean, we hit 8 o'clock. I do have mad more questions, but I think we took enough of your time tonight. But really appreciate it. I think one of the things that you all show is the power of what folks can do where they're at. You know what I'm saying? Like, you all are in different places. And kind of in different formations. There was a question about has there been like a national formation or group, or folks thinking about kind of like bringing together a national coalition around these issues? If so, please holler at me and Brandy. We would like to definitely participate in that. But this has been super informative. This has been super inspiring. And it shows us that like this work, like we can do it. That we have the power to do it. And I think, Shaun, your answer was a brilliant way to end that. In many places we have so many groups in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County that are doing great work, but we are under resourced. And this is one of our reimaginings is what happens when we resource those folks that are doing this work on a daily basis, 1, 2, 3-man teams, doing the work of 20 to 40 people. What happens when we resource folks that are from here, live here, are known here, trusted here, loved here, and already have that built-in community support? What happens when we see that take place? So I do want to also thank our ASL interpreters. You all did a wonderful, incredible job. We appreciate you all being with us today. I'll give you the last word, Brandy, tonight.
Okay. I really didn't have one, but I do want to say thank you to all of you. I want to thank our first panelists, and hoping that they are intentional about practicing self-care. We don't take pride in having them always regurgitate their pain and their trauma, but we appreciate them, offering themselves and making that sacrifice to make change in the community that is much needed. We thank you all for helping us reimagine public safety and helping our audience reimagine public safety tonight, and bringing it home and making it a reality and practical, and being courageous, all of you, to talk about these things in your spaces and at the tables that you're at, and doing this work through a racial equity lens. That is the difference. Keeping people who are directly impacted at the forefront and having this racial equity lens is going to help us win. And I think we can do this together. And I think this national table is on this panel right now, and we're getting started. We are going to continue this work. We're going to continue to work with you all. We appreciate you being a part of this team. And for the community, we will be having a follow-up and a report coming out from all of the data that we've collected and the conversations that we had from the folks on the ground here who are directly impacted. And lastly, but not least, shout out to those people who are doing mutual aid here in Pittsburgh on the ground. One thing about Pittsburgh, especially the activist community, is very rich with love. We take care of each other. We couldn't survive and thrive without one another. And that's a lot of hard work that those folks are doing who don't get highlighted out here. So thank you. You know who you are. I'm not going to start naming because I'll get in trouble. But thank you for all your mutual aid work out here and helping us get through this pandemic.
Peace. 100, y'all.